Hey guys, welcome to book review 180. Today I am going to be reviewing The Great Railway Bazaar by Train Through Asia by the great Paul Theroux. Um, so this is sort of a classic of travel literature. He took the trip in like 73, so that's really kind of getting on now. Paul's still alive, but kind of definitely elderly. Um, so he started in London and kind of did a whole trip around Asia. Um, I'll try not to go so much piece by piece. I've been noticing I've been doing that a little bit more in my reviews recently, but I guess I will do it piece by piece. Um, sort of the I'm not so much interested in like Europe or even the Middle East, but kind of the Eastern European part was kind of fascinating. Kind of the curmudgeonly, cranky characters and the eccentrics that rode the train. Um, and then as sort of a way to almost like a cleansing gate, if you will, between India and the richness of Asia and Europe, he goes through the Middle East, and things just slowly start to uh, thin out. Like there's, obviously the deserts and stuff like that, um, to the point where, well, let's see, I'm trying to think about what he did in Tehran. Well, Tehran he said he didn't enjoy because it was kind of had no historical significance and was just sort of like a big block housing. He did enjoy some of Western Turkey. I don't know if he saw the dervishes or not. I forget. Um, yeah, and he's also this book kind of surprised me a little bit because it covered the countries that they were in, but it's very specifically covered a lot about the trains in the countries they were in. Now, the trains are a good reflection, but maybe the book itself could have done a little bit better job of not trying to draw so many conclusions about the country just by what he saw on the trains. I'd say trains came before travel almost, although trains are a form of travel, so they're all kind of intertwined. Um, let's see. So Iran, he kind of goes into Afghanistan where he has some deriding comments. You got to remember, this is Afghanistan even before the Soviet Union invaded in the 80s. And it was run just by a bunch of mullahs. He said that it was previously more diverse, but then the mullahs, much like the Taliban, I guess, really put a tamp down on things, and he wanted to get out of Afghanistan as quickly as possible. So he goes, flies to Kabul, and does the Khyber Pass into Pakistan. In Pakistan, he kind of starts mentioning the lushness. I'm kind of having trouble doing this review because I'm not going to remember every single person he met along the train. But yeah, he definitely met some eccentric people in Pakistan. Pakistan was the. Oh yeah, he also talks about how they kind of went down the mountain, which is really, in more ways than one, kind of the big barrier between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Like Pakistan is in the valley; it's lush, for the most part. I mean, like around its borders, there's mountains and stuff, but like the center of its civilization is sort of, it's Muslim, but it's Indian subcontinent. Whereas people in Afghanistan are much more like herders, more grizzled looking, whereas people in Pakistan are more of the Indian subcontinent. I mean, that should be obvious, but he does not go to Karachi. He eventually goes to Lahore and Amistar, crossing the border. I think that there were delay issues crossing the border, as there would be in such circumstances. Goes into India, does what is it, like 3 or 4 trips in India? Goes to Simla up in the mountains. That's basically just like a land sort of stuck in time. Even now, stuck in time more for the tourists, but then just sort of like in slow decay from the colonial era. Goes down to Bombay. The one thing he's disappointed by is the Parsi that have the sky burials with the crows. He isn't able to see it, and that's off limits. But is able to see some of the other religious traditions down there. And also just see a lot of the grinding poverty. Later in the book, he mentions Bombay as a city built of money, whereas Calcutta is a city built of death, which I'll get to Calcutta in a second. That's very interesting. Goes back up to Delhi, takes Delhi down to Madras, Pondicherry, and then into Sri Lanka. I was a little bit disappointed by the Sri Lanka part, just because he mentioned that they went through a famine, and I think Sri Lanka is a really, really interesting country, and basically he just kind of went into Sri Lanka, saw how decrepit and destitute it was. You know, at this time period there were probably more starvation, more, well, I mean, they were both a humanitarian crisis at this point, but he particularly mentions it in Sri Lanka. Man, what's going on here? He doesn't really mention much beyond that. Now he does mention Madras and Pondicherry. Pondicherry being much like Simla, a relic of the colonial era. Then goes back up to Delhi, goes over to Calcutta, city of death, all that kind of stuff. Takes a plane flight to Bangkok, goes up to Laos, which he thinks is a joke. I think Laos at this point was like the capital of Vietnamese, was still under American influence, but all the countryside was Pathet Lao, which is communist. And so really he could only cross the border into Thailand, where Vietnamese is, and then see some of the weirdness of that place. You know, Bangkok is a city of sex and money and death, just like a combination of a lot of places in India, but still seemed even then sort of functioning, whereas Vietnamese was just kind of like this, not monstrosity, but sort of, yeah, just almost like Tehran, kind of like a city built for a modern era that became the largest city in the country that is really not of the country. I think that's an accurate analysis. Goes to Bangkok. Between Bangkok and Malaysia, he kind of loses his mind a little bit, starting to feel that travel fatigue. Eventually makes it down to Malaysia, where people are a little bit more conservative, you know, it being a Muslim country, but maybe not as conservative as, say, like Middle Eastern countries. He visits a number of eccentric characters there. That's pretty interesting. And I really thought the best part, then goes to Singapore. He mentioned some of his history in Singapore, how he was a professor there, and how everything's very clean, but it's like slightly authoritarian. Like you don't get the sense that like I don't know, it's not like North Korea or something like that. But the reason things work in an area of the world where things largely don't work is because it's very small. It has a very focused economy, and it's slightly authoritarian, that people can't get out of line or, you know, do all that kind of stuff. Next, he flies up to Vietnam. I found this certainly the most fascinating part of the book. Well, I don't know. There's a lot of fascinating parts, but he went there, like I said, I think in like 73, I think, or maybe like 74. So it was like as the Americans were pulling out, but before the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese had unified the country. So it was just Arvan. And what's kind of sadly funny is that there is a train rail, and I think they repaired it. I think it goes from Hue to Ho Chi Minh City now, or what was then Saigon. But at that time period, they tried to keep the trains running, but with all the bombings and sabotage by the Viet Cong, it was in five small little chunks that were all across the country. And one of the things that really stuck out in the book was the head of the Vietnamese railways that almost nobody used because you couldn't really get across the country. You could just do it only in small chunks. Had 5 different carriages on 5 different parts of the line. So like personal carriages for him. It was almost like Donald Trump or something, having like all these ridiculous private planes and stuff. Let's see. He mentions that one of the lines gets bombed previously. That's pretty hilarious. He gets to see Hue at probably its worst, like right when it's just completely bombed out. Same goes for Da Dang. He mentions those two, like you could really feel the effect of the war. More in Saigon, or what became Ho Chi Minh City. The war really wasn't engaged there until like the very end. Actually, after this book was, or after Paul went through South Vietnam, and even then the fighting was relatively minor. I think Ho Chi Minh City just kind of like collapsed, whereas like these other cities, they had like huge amounts of fighting that went in. What else? Oh, kind of he just gave a scope of the war itself. And what I thought particularly fascinating was he talked about the large-scale American bases and just trucks, and just that Americans themselves are big people. And when the Americans left Vietnam, the war seemed to shrink. Now, it was inevitable almost at that point that the North was going to win, but there were all these sort of abandoned bases and abandoned vehicles and just like scars of war that kind of on the scale of Vietnam just don't fit. It was kind of incongruent in that way, which I thought really painted a picture of, it's not a total picture of the war, but just a very sort of interesting picture about that point in time in the war. After that, he flies up to Japan, complains about Japan quite a bit. He says it's very clean, very efficient, trains run on time, they're well air conditioned, and he completely hates it. He compared it to the trains of India. Oh, I forgot to talk about classes in India. You know, there's all these different classes of people. What do they call that? The caste system. So they have all different types of trains to match. Sleeper train. He mostly does sleeper trains throughout the journey. And so by being in sleeper trains in India that are slow and don't run on time, he has sort of a languid pace that he very much enjoys. Whereas in Japan, there's no sleeper class. Trains take a couple hours max to get from place to place, at least to get from like Tokyo to Osaka or something like that. And he just completely hates it. People don't talk to one another. They literally are kind of in their own cubicle, whereas the hustle and bustle of India, people talking, arguing, all that kind of stuff. And something else he mentioned is that even the Prime Minister of Japan, not that this is kind of honorable, but it is what it is. The Prime Minister of Japan doesn't even have his own private car, train car. He goes commercial and just will sit in seats just like anyone else. But he also mentioned that the Emperor of Japan has 7 private cars. So there is some exception, but for the most part, there's very little sort of class differentiation, at least when it comes to the obvious things like trains in Japan. Now there's other class differentials, but for example, when he heads up north, I'll do the north part first, and then I'll talk about Osaka. When he goes up north, he mentions the native people who, name is kind of escaping me, but they're sort of all like wrapped up or whatever, and second-class citizens, essentially. He very much enjoys his time in Hokkaido. It's more spread out. There's tons and tons of snow. It just has a different feel than the rest of Japan. I should also mention he does most of this stuff by giving lectures at various spots along the way. I think at this point, Paul had become famous enough that he could do like lectures, but not famous enough in his writing that he could just strictly travel for travel's sake, which he does in some of his later books. Um, yeah, and he meets an eccentric professor. Oh, no, he doesn't meet him. He kind of learns about the history of an eccentric professor in Hokkaido and how, specifically, I think it's in Sapporo, where he kind of helped make that city or whatever. I forget what the professor's name is. He does go down to the ancient cities of Nara and Osaka and Kobe, Kyoto. See some of the stuff there. I don't really know too much to say about that. Complains about the train some more. And then briefly goes back to Tokyo, where he can't find warm winter clothing for the Siberian winter. Japanese being very sparse, don't really have warm clothes for beyond the bare minimum of how cold that their temperature gets. You really should have bought in Hokkaido, because Hokkaido gets cold, so I'm sure that they have like warm weather or cold weather clothing in Hokkaido, if not in the rest of Japan. Takes a crazy ship that sways on the waves, and everyone gets seasick. I think he said 2 people ate out of it was like a shipping ship, so there were only a relatively few number of passengers. But of like 15 passengers, I think like 2 would eat like dinner on a regular basis. Does not go to Vladivostok, because Vladivostok at that time is a closed naval port, but essentially goes to the sister city of Nekhoka. Yeah, and talks about how it feels like a city that like almost like a Martian city, like the environment is just so rough that it just feels like it shouldn't exist. And he sees more and more of that through Russia, but ironically, kind of the area along the coast feels a little bit more that way. And I think it's because it's like a shipping area, it's kind of very close to a military area, so there's some buildup. Whereas a lot of the other parts of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, particularly the countryside, feel very rustic. Just with like log cabin homes that look like shacks, with little fires, smoked fish. Let's see, what else? In comparison, there's also some big cities along the way that, much like the Vladivostok area, feel very brutalistic. These giant belching factories with their smoke and absolutely no concern for the environment. It's all very interesting. Meet some eccentric characters along the way, particularly he kind of dumps on Aussies throughout most of the book, which I'm in Australia right now, which I find pretty funny. And then kind of, again, slowly loses his mind before being able to make it to Moscow, has another delay in Moscow, and then really has no comment kind of on the way back. He kind of took the quick train from Moscow back to London so that he could see his family. Anyway, that's it. I don't want to go too long. Paul Theroux, The Great Railway Bazaar by Train Through Asia. I think I got most of it in. All right. The legendary Paul Theroux. All right. Bye, guys.